The snow fell like ashes over the stone walls of the besieged city, veiling the rot beneath in a quiet mercy. A hush, deeper than winter itself, had descended, not peace, not stillness, but the silence of things that forget they are alive. On the parapets, sentries once sharp-eyed and proud, now leaned like broken crosses, their eyes hollow, lips cracked, whispering prayers to saints who had long fled the heavens. They did not hope for salvation. They prayed for sleep, the kind from which one need not wake. In the alleys, rats had become currency. Children chased them not with mischief, but with desperation. A girl no older than 7 clutched a skinned carcass like a doll, humming to it, as if it might sing back. The boots of the dead boiled into broth, their souls softened into the last meals of the desperate. Leather was chewed down to threads, salt, a myth, hope, an extinct tongue. Inside what remained of the noble quarter, tapestries once spun with gold were used to plug arrow holes in shattered walls. Lords once draped in fur now bartered rings for rotten onions. The line between desperate and damned blurred, until even the city itself seemed unsure of what it had once been. And beneath it all the scent, not merely of rot or smoke, but the scent of surrender. It clung to every breath like mildew on forgotten parchment. It was the smell of a soul spoiling from within. In a chapel that once echoed with sacred song, a woman sat beside a bundle wrapped in the torn hem of her wedding dress. Her hands moved with infinite care over the child's cold face, smoothing hair already stiffening with death. She sang, though her voice was cracked, brittle. No one joined her. The walls, scorched by candle smoke and grief, merely absorbed the lullaby. No bells rang. They had melted weeks ago, cast into crude cannonballs, then stolen by deserters, then simply vanished. What prayers were left clung to the rafters like cobwebs, unseen, unanswered. Outside, the enemy waited. They were patient, cruel in their stillness. Their fires formed a ring around the city, orange and distant, like the judgment of old gods. They did not need to charge. Hunger did their work for them. They watched the city eat itself, one whisper, one coin, one bone at a time. Cannibalism did not arrive with a scream, nor a mob. It came softly. First, a glance, then, an excuse. A man wept beside the cooling body of his wife. His lips trembled, the warmth lingered. Grief staggered him, but hunger gave him purpose. He bit, then vomited, then bit again. And when the next day dawned, gray and hollow, he did not hide. Soon after, bones were no longer buried. They were sorted, by length, by tenderness. The market square once roared with song and barter. Now it was a theater of whispers. A black cloak opened to reveal fingers, cooked, salted. Not child, the seller insisted. Soldier, clean. Buyers did not ask questions. They only weighed flesh. No rebellion rose, no heroes charged. Only one man, Brother Tauric, once a scribe, now a shadow, etched every name he could remember onto the wall of the chapel's cellar. With charcoal and bleeding fingers, he tried to preserve a city being devoured, not by fire, but by forgetting. When asked why, he only answered, someone must remember what mercy looked like. The church doors were sealed now not against soldiers, but against shame. Within, priests argued not about scripture, but about whether the bones of martyrs could be boiled for stew. A child was caught, chewing a relic. No one stopped her. A city that once crowned kings now bartered in bones. And still the snow fell soft, endless, indifferent. There was no thunder of siege engines, no clarion charge. The enemy's silence became more terrifying than war. They had become myth in their stillness. Parents warned children not to dream too loudly, lest the wolves outside hear joy and decide to end it. The noble court held one final gathering. They wore what jewels remained, not out of vanity, but as armor shinning lies against the truth of their decay. One duchess, her eyes ringed with frostbite, toasted a future no one believed in. Her goblet was filled with melted snow and ash. No one noticed. That night, a fire broke out in the orphan quarter. It spread fastwood, cloth, straw, bone. People watched from rooftops, unmoving. Some whispered it was mercy, others called it theft. The children at least had not been devoured. A man stabbed his brother over a scrap of thigh. A woman laid herself at the altar and begged to be eaten, saying she had no children left to feed and no reason to remain whole. And somewhere above it all, the stars continued their silent vigil, caring, eternal. But beneath this horror, like a splinter in the throat, the question pulsed: who was truly damned, the eater, or the one who made him starve? Was it evil to devour, or more evil still to watch it happen, to feed the war, not with armies, but with waiting? The siege was no longer of stone or sword, it was a siege of the soul, a slow crucifixion of memory, of ritual, of dignity. The city began to forget the sound of laughter, the shape of mercy, the taste of bread, the difference between survival and surrender. And as winter deepened, and the snow fell thicker like ash, like absolution, something shifted. A child was born in the ruins of a library. His cry echoed through the catacombs and cellars, like a blade through silence. It reminded the dying of what life once felt like. No one dared hope, but they listened, and as the night wore on, and the fires outside the gate danced like devils, the city exhaled once more, not its last breath, perhaps, but a different one, ragged, uncertain, alive. And somewhere beneath the altar, Brother Talric dipped his fingers again in soot, and began to write the name of the newborn, because someone must remember what mercy looked like. A fog clung to the river like mourning cloth, and the fishers' boats, long stilled by war, rotted on the banks like abandoned prayers. The siege had lasted 17 weeks. Not a crier had called the hour, not a raven had circled the sky. Only the wind passed through the city, now thin and sharp, as if even it wished to flee. No bells, no barter, no bread, only the faint echo of a city unraveling. Beneath the broken archway of the outer wall, a mother pressed her lips to the brow of a child who no longer stirred. Her breath left a fog of its own, warm for a moment, before vanishing into the cold. Inside the keep, high above the starving streets, the lord of the city sat at his splintering table, tracing circles into the grain with a dulled dagger. The blade, once meant for ceremony, now served only the slow, mad rhythm of waiting. 17 weeks of siege had emptied the granaries, soured the wells, and turned the heart of every man into a locked chest, guarded and hollow. His steward stood behind him, muttering nonsense in riddled rhyme, lost to whatever fragile string of sanity had once tethered him to reason. He no longer reported the death toll. He no longer used names. He only said things like, "The parchment sang today," or, "The dogs argued with the wind." The Lord understood. There was no use naming the dead any more. They had eaten the horses, first noble beasts, once clad in gilded armor, now boiled for marrow. Then the dogs, then, in quiet desperation, they stripped the tapestries from the hall, searching for scraps of grain sewn into ancient weavings. And when nothing remained, not even rats, they turned to the unthinkable. In the kitchens, funeral shrouds were folded, not with reverence, but with hunger. A cook, once praised for his pheasant stews, now asked whether rites were still required for the flesh of the recently departed. No one answered, no one could. Down in the crypts, torchlight flickered like a dying heartbeat across the stone walls. Dust stirred in long-forgotten corners, and the scent of old incense could not mask the rot. The iron seal that protected the tombs had been broken once, then again, then routinely. A rib bone clattered onto stone, handled not by a thief, but by a citizen. A hand that once held a quill, now trembling, gripped the bone like a spoon, scraping it hollow. There was no malice, no madness, only necessity. When the priests discovered the desecration, they stared long and hard at the disturbed remains. Then they said nothing. Their fingers curled over their own aching stomachs, and their silence was more damning than any curse. Above, in what remained of the city's cathedral, candles still burned, but fewer each day. Their wax was harvested at night, and melted into broth. Even the light was eaten now. A young scribe, barely more than a boy, sat by the stained glass window, its colors dulled by ash and shadow. His job was to record the deaths. At first, he did so with care names, dates, final words. But now he skipped names. He skipped them not because he didn't know them, but because he did. He had held their hands in life. He had passed them in the market, heard their songs, shared their bread. But what now, when that same flesh had been returned to him in secret bowls? What now, when remembrance itself became a crime of shame? He dipped his quill into ink, thinned with tears and scratched only numbers. The dead became tally marks. Line after line, silent, anonymous. In the city's library, scrolls once read in awe were now curled in the hearth, their flames quick and unceremonious. History burned. Knowledge fed the fire. Parchments that once bore royal decrees now filled the cook fires that boiled bone. Outside the walls, the enemy waited. Their siege lines quiet, their fires glowing like distant stars across the frozen plains. And from time to time, their laughter rose of triumph, the clink of goblets, the dance of voices untouched by hunger. It was mockery, but it was also a reminder, somewhere, beyond the barricade of death, life still moved. Inside, silence had devoured all. Even crying had become rare. It required strength. Music was a memory. The only rhythm was the slow creak of doors, the whisper of fabric over skeletal limbs, the clink of metal teeth carving into what should not be carved. And winter deepened. Snow fell not as a blessing, but as a mirror, white upon ash, silence upon silence. Children drew faces on frost-covered windows, not in play, but in prayer. And when those faces melted, it felt like losing someone all over again. In the cloisters, once echoing with hymns, monks no longer sang. They sat in huddled circles, eyes closed, pretending to meditate when truly, they were imagining warmth, or meat, or forgiveness. One monk whispered, "If God sees us now, he weeps." Another replied, "If God sees us now, he turns away." But still, the people endured. They endured in the quiet places, in libraries where pages were torn but not forgotten, in crypts where guilt outweighed hunger, in kitchens where hands trembled over pots that had nothing left to give. They endured because they had to, because even when humanity cracked, it left behind a shard of light. The Lord, in his keep, rose from his chair for the first time in days. He walked to the narrow window slit, stared out over the city he no longer ruled. The streets were empty, the sky bruised with the promise of another storm. He placed his hand on the stone, and whispered a name, his son's, perhaps, or the city's own. Below, the river murmured, its waters thick with frost, and in that whisper, a prayer, not for salvation. That dream had long fled, but for snow, for the snow to fall hard enough, long enough, deep enough to cover what they had become, to bury the truth of survival in white silence. And somewhere, in the far distance beyond the wall, a crow called, one single note, not a warning, but a memory, and the chapter faded, not with a scream or a clash, but with the soft sound of snow meeting stone, and a city waiting, still breathing, beneath its own sorrow. The scent of burning vellum curled through the cloisters, ash drifted through the arches like gray snow, each flake once a scripture, now a memory fading midair. The monks fed the hearth with their life's labors, inked with trembling hands, prayers penned in candlelit solitude, offered now to flame like lambs to altar. Ink hissed as it died, tiny voices whispering their last breath in black smoke. In the refectory, silence reigned, not the silence of prayer nor peace, but a hollow stillness. No one dared to mention God anymore. Not here, not after what the cellar began storing behind the iron door. Outside, the siege groaned like a distant storm, not in thunder, but in hunger. The granaries were long emptied, turned into echo chambers where hope once lived and now starved. Children placed their ears to the wood, pretending to hear the rustle of grain. But the sound was wind, only wind. The city did not descend into madness. No, it rose into something darker, quiet resignation. There was no wailing in the streets, no desperate pleas to the heavens, just faces dulled into waxen masks, moving like shadows through alleys slick with frost and forgotten blood. Death no longer frightened. It waited like an old friend, a quiet companion in the corner. In what once was a butcher's shop, where knives once glistened and fat sizzled in morning air, a boy sat cross-legged in the dark, 9 winters behind his bones, and none prepared him for the sight of his father trading his sister's corpse for salt. It wasn't a secret, no cloak of shame, just a transaction. Like bread once was, the salt brought flavor. Her name brought guilt. He chewed both. Above them, in the broken ribs of the cathedral, the bell cracked, not from siege or war, but from winter's slow and cruel bite. It rang once, then no more. The bishop, once robed in sapphire and ermine, now wore wool stitched with silence. He still whispered sermons in sleep. But when he woke, it was screams that filled the air. He could no longer tell if they were from grief or feasting. He no longer walked among his flock. He watched them from stained glass shadows, as the holy melted into hunger. Once, he tried to bless a child who died in her sleep. The mother had screamed, not at her daughter's death, but at the bishop's hands, because they smelled of roasted marrow. A diary surfaced from beneath the floorboards of a convent, its pages thin, greasy, blood-stained. It didn't hold psalms. It held recipes, ones never meant to exist. Thigh of kin, boiled with thistle root. Pray first. The margins were filled with tiny crosses, as if faith could bleach the horror, as if ink could absolve the taste of human sorrow. In a square once bursting with apples and laughter, people gathered not to trade, but to remember how. A woman mimed the motion of peeling fruit. Her eyes were closed, her hands gentle, as if the apple were still there. A boy clapped. A man wept. Behind the chapel, the iron door thudded closed again. No one asked what lay behind it. Some guessed salted limbs, others guessed worse. Hope, that someone had stored it like wine, waiting for the right moment to uncork its madness. But no one dared speak. Not anymore. Words were dangerous. They stirred longing. At night, the wind howled through the city's bones. It slipped through arrow slits, stirred tapestries eaten half by mold. It whispered through the ribs of those still breathing, reminding them, "You are hollow." A child approached the bishop once, eyes wide, voice too steady. "If we eat the wicked, are we holy?" The bishop said nothing. He only wept, and when the child left, so did the last flicker of fire in the bishop's eyes. Still the gates held, thick oak and iron, kissed by frost, scarred by siege, but unbroken. Outside, the enemy camped in silence. No arrows, no drums, just waiting. They didn't need to breach. They only needed time. Time would do what swords could not. Within the city, rot crept like ivy. Walls wept. Stone bled moss and sorrow. Rats grew bold, scuttling through the silent abbeys, gnawing at things once sacred. In the noble quarter, where laughter once rang through tapestries and silver cups, a lone knight sat in full armor at his feasting table, a goblet before him, empty. He had polished his sword, washed his hands, set the table with care, and then he wept, not from hunger, but from memory. Of dinners past, of brothers now bones, of honor, now dust. He did not rise. The feast he imagined was kinder than what the city offered. Some had tried escape. A mother and her twins slipped into the sewers, clinging to the stench of rot over the promise of teeth. They were never seen again. But sometimes, on moonless nights, the grates groaned. Some say it was rats, others say it was chewing. The baker's oven, once warm with crust and laughter, now stood cold, but sometimes, smoke rose. No one asked, but all smelled it. In the high tower, a monk sat copying scripture from memory on skin, his own. He carved psalms into his thigh, hoping the pain would drown the hunger. He named each cut a virtue: faith, charity, temperance. He never made it to hope. Even the dogs stopped barking. The last one was seen gnawing its own paw beneath the statue of Saint Mercy, and yet, the city did not surrender. Not out of pride, but because surrender meant facing what they'd become. As long as the gates held, they could pretend just a little longer that they were still people. Beneath it all, in the crypts where light feared to linger, voices prayed, not for salvation, but for sleep. Final, dreamless, guiltless sleep. Outside, the enemy lit torches, not to attack, but to watch. Inside, a child drew a picture in soot, a family, holding hands, smiling. The paper tore. He didn't notice, and as the dawn broke and golden but gray and silent, the city exhaled. Together, as if the soul of it had loosened its grip on breath, the frost thawed slightly, just enough to reveal bones in the courtyard, posed like dancers. The bishop looked to the sky, and whispered a final sermon. It ended not with amen, but with silence. And far beyond the walls, in a tent flapping with the winds of patience, the enemy smiled. Because tomorrow they would enter, and they would find nothing left to conquer, only bones, guilt, and the taste of what a soul costs when stripped of law and light. The wind carried the stench of boiled leather, and the sour rot of despair. It clung to the stone, seeped through the arrow slits, and settled in the lungs of those still breathing. Along the battlements, defenders did not stand, they swayed, as if drunk on starvation. One slid to his knees beside a rusted cauldron. Once it had hissed with pitch, a weapon of war. Now it held a stew that did not steam, did not boil, it only waited. No one asked what simmered within, no one could afford the answer. In the square below, silence sold for a price. Beneath a canopy so thin, it might have once been a burial shroud, an old woman sat. She offered no food, no wares, only a mouth that moved with no sound. Her coins, melted down from crucifixes, stolen from tombs and altars, clinked like brittle bones in the pouch at her side. Her eyes never left the snowbank behind her. That's where her daughter slept, curled like a lamb, a grave without depth, a sleep without end. The woman's smile had not changed since the moment they covered the child's face in frost. It had cracked, not vanished. Her lips peeled in the cold, but the corners held, eternal, insane. She whispered stories, fairy tales with no endings, no heroes, just wind and wolves. Elsewhere, in the skeleton of a bakery, black soot painted claw marks across stone. Desperate hands had scraped at walls and floorboards, not for warmth but for flour, for crumbs, for memory. Children now played there. They clapped ashes into loaves, pretended heat into ovens, and fed each other with shadows. Their laughter was sudden, sharp, it stabbed through the air like a mistake, too pure for this hour, too bright to be trusted. A knight stood vigil in the great hall, his armor was a patchwork of dents and hope, pieces borrowed from the dead and dying. He did not pray. His sword lay beside him, untouched. His gaze stayed on the corpse at his feet, not felled in battle, but surrendered to hunger. Skin drawn tight, mouth parted in eternal ache. The knight wept, not for the body, not any more. He wept for the bowl in his lap, the broth still warm, the meat gone, too thick, too rich, and the bones, too soft. He knew what he had eaten, knew what it cost him, and still he swallowed. The chapel, once a refuge, now bore its own wound. Nailed to its splintered door was a parchment, a decree, unsigned. All bodies belong to the state. Above the rusting nail, someone had scrawled a second line, shaky, childlike, desperate. Let my mother sleep whole. No one removed it. No one obeyed it. The tunnels beneath the city twisted like intestines, dark and wet. There, in that buried night, figures moved with the slowness of shame. Torches flickered like guilt on stone walls. They bartered not with coin, but with bone. A rib for a loaf, a wrist for a flask. Trades wrapped in mourning, spoken in murmurs. One man clutched a satchel to his chest. Inside was his brother's skull, not for love, not for grief, but because marrow still clung to its hollows. That smell meant warmth. That smell meant life. In the tower above, the commander had not spoken in 4 days. His maps lay untouched. His ink had frozen. He listened to the city more than he watched it now. Listened to the cracks in silence, the soft thuds of collapsed roofs, the screams that tried to hide themselves in snow. He had thought the siege was the enemy, but now he understood. The gates held, the walls stood, but the true rot had bloomed from within. In the keep, a tapestry still hung, though half its threads had unraveled. It once showed a stag in the forest, noble and defiant. Now the stag's eye was gone, scratched away. In its place, a hole that stared back. The lords had long fled, or else become dust. Power had slipped beneath the floorboards, searching for bones to gnaw on. A boy wandered the armory, too young for sword, too thin for armor. He touched each blade like it might whisper a way out. None did. Instead he found a belt of daggers, and wrapped it around his waist, not to fight, but to trade. Steel, now, was cheaper than flesh. The city had begun to speak to itself through whispers in stairwells, messages carved into doors, prayers left on window panes in blood or soot. Not prayers to God, but to mercy, to forgetting. The snow never melted. It piled on rooftops, covered the fallen, softened the ruins. In one alley, a man had frozen upright, mouth open as if calling for someone he knew would not come. They left him there. He became a warning, or perhaps a monument, or simply another part of the city's anatomy. At night, the stars watched, indifferent, eternal. Their silence mocked the prayers of the city below, a city that no longer begged for rescue, only for rest. And somewhere, beyond the fog, beyond the siege lines, drums still echoed, a rhythm that did not match the city's dying breath. The enemy waited not with swords, but with time. Time was the cruelest weapon. Time devoured cities without a single blow. And yet, a girl lit a candle in a shattered alcove. Its flame flickered against broken glass. She hummed a lullaby too old to remember, and placed a crust of bread stolen, saved, sacred beneath the Virgin's gaze. She had not spoken in days, but in that silence, something else stirred. Not hope, that was too much, but defiance, thin, brittle, bright. It would not save them, but it would remind them for one more night that they had once been human. The candle burned low, the wind pressed against the walls. The city did not cry out, it only breathed shallow, ragged, and waited for morning. If morning still remembered how to come. Snowflakes melted on the lips of the dead, aligned in rows along the cathedral nave, their mouths slightly parted, as if still whispering prayers drank the cold in silence. No incense, no candlelight. The holy oils had run dry weeks ago, their final drops rubbed not on the brows of the dying, but into aching joints of shivering priests. The sacred now clung only to memory. Above them, the vaulted ceiling wept with frost, the wind outside howling through arrow slits like a chorus of lost monks. The great bells had not tolled in 40 nights, not for mass, not for death. The ropes had frayed and snapped like tendons stretched too thin. In the shadows of the sanctuary, where once organ pipes sang glory, rats now held council. Their claws echoed against stone like the mockery of drums mocking the prayers, the hymns, the sanctity. Once, this place had been sanctuary. Now, it was a tomb with sermons. A child walked barefoot through the empty market square, snow-kissing the rawness of his soles. He did not flinch. He did not whimper. In his arms, a doll fashioned from rags and brittle chicken bones, a crude effigy of comfort. He hummed softly, a lullaby once sung at feast days, its words forgotten but rhythm intact. Children no longer cried in this city. They listened, they watched, and they chewed in silence. His eyes passed over doorways sealed with ash and mud, windows shuttered not to hold out cold, but to shut out guilt. Inside, the living hunched like shadows, warming their hands over embers made from hymnals. First they burned the pages, then the covers, then the benches where they once knelt. The Guildhall, once a citadel of artistry, had become something darker. Its wooden crest, carved with laurels and compasses, hung askew, bloodied fingerprints trailing down its varnish. Inside, artisans no longer debated frescoes or stonework. They argued over sinew, over marrow, over rot. "We must boil it in lime," said the tanner. his voice hoarse, as if scalded by his own suggestion. "No, salt it." "Like Bohr," countered the mason, with eyes that no longer recognized what he was building. The scribe wrote it all down, his ink frozen, replaced with soot, mixed with tears. His hands trembled not from cold, but from knowing these were recipes, not records. These were blueprints for forgetting. Beyond them, the noble quarter cracked under its own illusion. Stained glass, splintered not from siege, but from within. In one turret, a nobleman wrapped in fur leapt, his body folding in silence as it struck the snow. There was no cry, no crowd, only a woman who stepped forward, expressionless, to gather the colored shards like firewood. Her palms bled, red on blue on gold, but she did not flinch. She welcomed the sting. Pain was memory. Pain was proof. Elsewhere, beneath a mound of cloaks sewn from velvet and death, the bishop held mass. He stood thin as shadow, cheeks sunk like caved-in tombs. His breath fogged as he spoke. Christ, too, was broken, he whispered, and consumed. No one sang, no one knelt, but heads bowed instinctively, as if even hunger could not unlearn reverence. He raised his hands not to bless, but to shake. Over his altar, the corpses were laid in neat rows, their limbs sorted with the precision of butchers and the pity of monks. Redemption, he said, could be found even here, especially here. Outside the walls, the enemy camp was silent. Their fires remained unlit. The general's tent billowed in the wind like a funeral shroud. One commander leaned on his spear, watching the dim figures move through the ruined city like ghosts. "They won't last the week," he muttered. But he was wrong, because hunger is not a death sentence. It is a crucible. It teaches, not how to die, but how to forget what life once meant. Within the city, memories unraveled like old rope. Mothers forgot lullabies. Blacksmiths forgot the shape of iron. Priests forgot the warmth of wine. Even the rats began to forget to run. The doll in the boy's arms lost its face. The rags turned gray with ash. He watched two men argue over a belt. Not its leather, but the buckle melted down. It might be poured into a mold, might become a knife. The baker's widow fed her son a broth made from candle stubs and pigeon feathers. She told him it was stew. He believed her, not because he was naive, but because belief was warmer than truth. In the catacombs, bones were rearranged not for burial rites, but for storage. Femurs were wrapped in cloth like firewood, skulls placed in buckets. They no longer named the dead, they numbered them. The city's oldest bell ringer died with his fingers curled as if still pulling rope. His daughter used his shoes for soup. The leather softened in water. She added salt. She added prayer. Neither changed the taste. By the 13th week, hunger no longer howled. It whispered. It slithered. It settled in the bones. People did not collapse. They faded, like frescoes washed by centuries. Their smiles still traced on walls, but hollow, the color leached by time and need. And yet somehow they lived. Not all, not whole, but enough. Enough to watch the snows melt. Enough to see grass curl up from cracks. Enough to hear birdsong, not the full chorus, but a single note, hesitant and thin. One morning, the child placed his doll on the cathedral steps and walked away. No one took it. No one followed. But the act itself was a kind of liturgy. Inside, the bishop's robes hung on a nail, empty. The altar had been stripped, the oil gone, the bodies moved. In their place, a single loaf baked from moss and crushed bark sat in the center, an offering, or a warning. Outside the city, the enemy army watched smoke rise, not from fires of despair, but of preparation. And they knew this city would not fall, it would forget, it would deform, it would feed on ash and memory. But it would remain, not because it remembered life, but because it had learned how to outlive death. The oil lamps in the apothecary flickered low, casting trembling shadows on walls lined with dust and despair. Once, their flame had danced above remedies and hope, balms for fevered brows, elixirs for sleepless babes. Now they burned with a different purpose, not to heal, but to hush. Not for restoration, but for ritual. Glass bottles trembled on warped shelves as footsteps passed overhead. Inside one vial, laudanum. In another, wormwood steeped in ash. A third was no longer labeled, but it gleamed with a viscous sheen the color of congealed blood. These tinctures were no longer taken for illness, but for forgetting, for softening the shriek in one's own skull when conscience began to stir. Behind the apothecary, beneath a drenched burlap curtain, silence was being carved. A surgeon, once praised for stitching battlefield wounds, now used his scalpel for secrets. No patients came to him anymore. Only messengers with coin and corpses. He did not ask for names. He only asked where the cut should be made. Outside, the siege hung over the harbor, like a second sky. The sails of forgotten ships sagged like shrouds. Ropes dangled like severed limbs, soaked in salt and something fouler. Gulls no longer cried overhead, they feasted. The water beneath them, once a mirror of commerce and glory, now bore only bloated driftwood and things that once had faces. Still the fishermen came. Barefoot, bent, reeking of rust and rot, they cast their nets into black waters without a prayer. Their lines no longer sought fish, but anything that floated. A child's shoe. A cat's rib cage. Once, a barrel split open to reveal salted flesh, packed like cordwood. No one spoke of it. They only carried it away. In the city square, life continued its imitation of ritual. The stage, once lit by lanterns and laughter, now hosted the auction of hunger. Where jugglers once danced, now stood gaunt men with sticks, pushing back crowds. A scrap of intestine, dried, brittle, barely edible, sold for a ruby ring. A duchess, draped in velvet woven by hand and hope, dropped her earrings for a marrowless bone. The auctioneer never asked where the meat came from. Neither did the buyers. It was the unspoken covenant of survival. Eat first, weep later. On the 7th day of the siege's 3rd month, a sound pierced the market square. It was not a trumpet or a scream. It was the bell ringer. Mute from birth, he had served his tower in silence, pulling rope with diligence and devotion. But on that day, his mouth opened, and a sound poured forth. Not language, not lament, a cry so primal it bypassed words and memory, clawing straight into the marrow of every listener. Soldiers fell to their knees. Mothers clutched their ears. Even the rats scurried into drains. The bell itself remained still, yet the cry reverberated through stone and skin alike, a sound not born of voice, but of something beneath it, something ancient and breaking. Farther out, near the breach where the city wall had been torn by flame and iron, a widow painted. Her husband's blood had dried weeks ago, her son's just days. She dipped her fingers into the congealed offering, and began to draw, circles, runes, figures, on crumbled stones, on hollowed cheeks, even on her own breast. She spoke to no one. When asked, she would only whisper, "To remember, before we forget everything." No one tried to stop her, and so she painted the city with memory. The raven came next, perched atop the spire of the Grand Archive. It watched the world rot beneath it. The archive, once echoing with scholars and scribes, was now a hollowed carcass. The scrolls were gone, eaten, or burned. In their place, nests of rats, and deeper still, in the bowels below the stone stair, shadows huddled, men and women too shamed to beg, too hunted to flee. They whispered among themselves, not of salvation, but of escape, not of gods, but of holes in the ground. One wrote prayers in soot across the bricks, "Forgive us for surviving." By the end of that moon's turn, the grave diggers laid down their shovels. The earth had hardened, defiant, the frost turned soil into stone, and besides, each burial became a question. Should we waste this? The flesh, once sacred, had become silent currency, a gesture of sacrifice, a final offering. No one spoke of cannibalism. That would require admitting guilt. Instead, they called it returning. Returning what was taken, returning warmth to the living. In a cathedral once carved to praise light, a priest lit no candles. He sat in silence beside the bones of choir boys, listening to the drip of melting snow from broken beams. He did not pray aloud. His God, it seemed, had chosen silence too. A child wandered into the nave one dusk, carrying a bowl carved from a skull. She offered it to the priest. "Is it holy?" she asked. He wept, not for her question, but for how gently she had asked it. The city, once a jewel of the coast, no longer resisted the siege. Resistance required hope. Now it embraced its ruin like a cloak. It had become a cathedral of hunger, each corner an altar, each alley a confessional. Knives became the new scripture, and communion. Communion was taken in silence, shoulder to shoulder, never asking the name of what was shared. And still, above it all the raven watched. Its eyes, black as ink and older than scripture, scanned the smoking towers, the frozen wells, the painted walls. It saw what the others dared not. The thing growing beneath despair, not madness, not death. Memory. Memory, clawing its way out of the frost. Memory, kept alive by the widow's blood, by the priest's tears, by the child's offering. And so the raven took flight, cutting across the sky like a question. Far to the north, beyond the breach, beyond the siege lines, a new shadow stirred. One not born of war, but of return. Not all survivors had stayed. Some had fled to darker lands, lands where famine was not a curse, but a tradition. They had learned new rituals there, learned to become the hunger itself. And now, they were returning. The city, broken and bent, had prepared itself against war, but not for what comes after. Not for the ones who walk with full bellies and empty eyes.